Imagine walking through the smoldering ruins of London after the fire of 1666. The streets are blackened, silent, yet alive in a way you can feel pressing against your skin. Shadows twist unnaturally, and tiny orange lights blink from the rubble, forming faces that whisper names. Names of the living, the dead, and everyone in between. You try to look away, but your body obeys a rhythm that is not your own, every step catalogued, every breath recorded. You are not just a survivor. You are being watched by the city itself, a ledger of fire and memory that will never let you go. The fire had ended, yet the city breathed in a way that belonged neither to the living nor to the dead. Streets blackened with char and ash exhaled a lingering heat, a memory of flame that clung to stone and timber as if every beam and every brick carried the echo of their own destruction. Among the ruins, the smell of smoke lingered, thick and acrid, mingling with the sweetness of charred wood, pressing into the noses of those who dared to wander through the skeletal remains of homes and shops. At dusk, tiny points of light began to emerge from the rubble, flickering orange and gold between collapsed walls and scorched timbers, hovering where no human body could have survived. They were eyes, observers born from ash and ruin, blinking in impossible rhythm, shifting subtly with each gust of wind, as if breathing with a life of their own. They did not follow logic or distance. They appeared where they were needed, tracking movement without motion, naming those who walked among them. The whispers came next, soft and insistent, threading through the air without form, a susurrus that seemed to curl into the ears and sinuses of survivors. Names were spoken, not aloud, but in a vibration that shivered along bones, recalling the last moments of those who had perished in the blaze. Some heard their own names, uttered by mouths that had been silent for days, weeks, a month now, voices carried in the faint crackle of ash. Fear settled over the city like a second smoke, invisible and suffocating, yet no one dared speak of it at first, for acknowledgement seemed to draw the watching closer, to mark oneself as another entry in the fire's ledger. Windows, shattered and soot-stained, reflected glimmers of light where no fire remained, and pedestrians crossed streets with heads lowered, avoiding eye contact with the ruin itself, yet unable to escape the feeling of being counted. Shadows stretched unnaturally, cast not by the remaining sun, but by some unseen choreography of ruin and ember, and every step on the cobbled streets felt measured, as if the city itself had become a counting machine, a patient observer recording the rhythm of survival. Children who strayed too near collapsed walls sometimes froze, staring at the flickering points, their small hands trembling, faces pale in the smoky twilight. The lights did not chase, did not harm. They observed, patient, methodical, memorizing every hesitation, every tremor of fear, every stolen glance. Even the buildings seemed aware, leaning slightly toward the observers, chimneys tilted as if bowing to the unseen audience, corners darkened to hide the witnesses yet offering them the most intimate vantage. The wind carried the scent of ash and faint cinders into homes, infiltrating clothing and hair, clinging to skin in a layer of memory that could not be washed away. Those who ventured near the edges of what had once been familiar streets often returned hollow-eyed, their bodies moving with a subtle stiffness, fingers curling unconsciously, knees bending in rhythms that were not their own, as though the city had begun imprinting itself upon them. By the time the moon rose fully, the glow of eyes had multiplied, forming clusters that hinted at faces both human and impossible, hovering over ruined hearths, collapsed staircases, the remains of marketplaces where goods had once been sold. Survivors slept uneasily, dreams invaded by the blink of orange light, names whispered in cadence with their own heartbeat, leaving them to wake with the sensation that the fire had not truly ended, that the city itself had learned to remember, to watch, to catalog every breath, every motion, every flicker of life that remained amidst the ashes. Each night the eyes multiplied, spilling over from the ruins into alleys and half-collapsed courtyards, forming clusters that glimmered like embered faces among the charred remnants of London. They hovered above broken beams and scorched stone, lingering where the air was thickest with the smell of smoke, as though the fire had left not only ash but a consciousness in its wake. Whispers followed them, soft and insidious, curling into ears and drifting down the spine, voices that did not speak aloud yet pressed insistently against thought, sliding beneath skin, weaving into dreams like silk threads soaked in soot. Names emerged from the darkness, sometimes slow, sometimes rushed, the syllables familiar and alien at once, echoing from places that had known the final agony of those consumed by flame. Survivors awoke in cold sweat, fragments of memories that were not their own lodged in their minds, recalling the choking heat, the panic of neighbors, the last tremors of strangers who had screamed too late. Even the rain failed to wash the scent away, which clung thick and sweet to the corners of ruined homes, pressing into every crevice where life had once thrummed. Cobblestones, slick with soot and lingering water, reflected the flickering eyes, multiplying their numbers with every glance, stretching into alleys and doorways until the city seemed to pulse with a rhythm older than human fear, older than the fire itself. Children who strayed into these ruins, searching for coins or stray cats, stopped abruptly in the blackened streets, feeling unseen gazes following every step, shadows bending toward them with patience so meticulous it was unbearable. Tiny fingers froze midair, the skin crawling with anticipation as the eyes tracked their movements, noting the lift of a hand, the tilt of a shoulder, the way they breathed. Those who tried to look away found themselves compelled to stare, the eyes pulling attention as surely as gravity, demanding recognition even as terror built a weight in the chest that made every heartbeat a drum of warning. The shadows between burned beams seemed to lengthen and shorten independently, stretching in ways that were impossible, bending along walls and puddles, crawling along broken wood as if the ruins themselves were alive, and yet the light in the eyes never wavered, never faltered, patient beyond human comprehension. Some nights, clusters formed faces more defined than ever, eyes flickering within the glow, mouths that whispered silent syllables, cheeks that trembled in the cold, invisible wind of the aftermath. They leaned forward from collapsed window frames, peeked from between bricks still smoldering, watched from the skeletal remains of market stalls, and the city grew ever more oppressive with the sense that it was not merely a place, but an observer, cataloging each tremor of life that dared to wander through its streets. Adults moving through the remains felt their memories dislodge, recalling not only the night of the fire, but the final moments of those around them, as if the city had pressed their recollections into their skulls with invisible fingers. Every motion of theirs was noted, every hesitation recorded, and those who lingered too long discovered that their limbs began to twitch, bending subtly in the rhythm of the watching, shoulders tilting as though obeying some unseen instruction, knees flexing with imperceptible precision, hands curling at angles not chosen by the conscious mind. The rain, though constant, seemed to carry no relief. Its touch only amplified the smell of char and the sweetness of burning resin that had soaked into the bones of buildings. Lanterns carried by survivors trembled despite calm air, flames bending toward shadows, reflecting the light of eyes that had multiplied into the hundreds, then thousands, until no corner of the city was safe from observation. Merchants, long since driven from their burned shops, peered from temporary shelters to witness the phenomena, their stomachs twisting as clusters of orange light gathered in familiar places, forming faces that spoke without voice, naming friends, lovers, strangers whose deaths had once gone unnoticed. Each whisper was a pull on memory, a tug at conscience, and even those who had survived the fire without witnessing death firsthand found themselves replaying screams and coughs not their own, hearts beating in time with the rhythm of eyes that had learned to count. Some attempted to flee the streets at night, but when moonlight struck puddles or the glint of shattered glass, the eyes were reflected again, appearing behind them where no body could stand, multiplying endlessly, following in a patience that no fear could outrun. Families who slept in makeshift dwellings awoke to the faint flicker of orange glow seeping through cracks, the whispers of names pressing against consciousness as if demanding acknowledgement, demanding participation in a tally that none could refuse. Those who tried to bury their heads in blankets or close shutters found the sensation of being watched remained, pressing invisibly against their chest, crawling along the spine, threading into sinew and marrow, until even motionless bodies were subtly influenced, unconsciously mirroring gestures recorded by the city itself. As nights passed, the eyes grew bolder, venturing farther from the immediate ruins, peering over new scaffolding, lingering in reconstructed streets, observing lives rebuilt too quickly, recording hesitation, fear, joy, the tremor of hope in movements that had thought themselves private. Children who crept near charred walls learned the rhythm of observation, sensing when eyes would blink, when they would flicker, when they would vanish entirely, leaving only a memory of being counted. Adults, too, began to move in silence, feeling the weight of presence in the air, limbs bending subtly, posture adjusting to accommodate watchers invisible yet infinitely patient, the city's ledger expanding to include even the reluctant. By the third week, it was no longer possible to move through London without the persistent awareness that every step, every glance, every breath was accounted for, every hesitation mirrored in orange flickers among char and ruin, and those who dwelled too long in the streets began to awaken from dreams with limbs arranged at impossible angles, eyes widened in silent terror, and the unsettling certainty that the fire had never truly ended, that the city itself had learned to watch, too. Remember, to claim each surviving soul in its patient, unyielding gaze. Merchants and laborers began to avoid entire blocks. The memory of the fire now mingled with a deeper, more insidious presence that lingered in the air above charred stone and smoldering timber. The streets, once familiar, seemed to curve and fold in ways that defied logic, and every corner held the weight of invisible accusation. Even those who had witnessed the blaze firsthand felt a shiver crawl along their spines when peering into the blackened rubble, for faces formed in ash and soot appeared to know their guilt, lingering in moments too brief for human sight, yet long enough to settle a trembling dread in the chest. The eyes multiplied with patient methodicalness, flicking from brick to bone to body, counting, observing, never blinking, their presence insistent and undeniable. A man who had pulled a neighbor from the flames wept in his sleep, only to awaken to a pair of eyes burning atop his pillow, unblinking, orange and alive, as if the city itself had entered his room to witness him, to measure him, to record him as part of its tally. Even the air inside his home carried the faint tang of smoke and burnt resin, suffocating and sweet, threading through the hair and the linens, pressing against lungs with the memory of the fire embedded in every molecule. By the fourth night after the inferno, curiosity had been replaced by compulsion. Survivors moved through streets that had once been their own, drawn to ruins by a terrifying magnetism, unable to resist the pull of the blinking lights that seemed to anticipate each step, each breath. The ruins no longer remained passive. They called with a rhythm that threaded beneath skin and sinew, tugging at hearts and minds with a precision older than the city itself. Even those who tried to shield themselves in rooms with closed shutters felt the presence of the eyes pressing against the glass, reflected in water pooled on floors, mirrored in polished brass, flickering in the embers of dying candles as if observing their tiniest gestures. Families who huddled together in tents erected among the rubble awoke to the sensation of being watched, their limbs twitching unconsciously, knees bending, shoulders tilting slightly in response to observers they could not see. The city had learned to extend itself beyond the ruins, reaching into dwellings, into the dreams of survivors, into the rhythm of everyday life. Children wandered the streets at dawn, their small steps careful, cautious, but the eyes followed, lingering longer in the shadows than any human could, measuring, calculating, storing the fear, the innocence, the hesitation. Those who ventured near markets half rebuilt saw figures flicker in alleyways, eyes hovering above debris, counting, naming, pressing memories of the fire into the mind like a whisper that would not be ignored. Tradesmen who sought to clear rubble from their shops discovered that even their hands trembled in subtle mimicry, bending and curling with a rhythm they had not chosen, as if the city had begun to dictate the choreography of motion, bending the living to its own will. At night, the air carried the thick scent of burnt wood, resin, and iron, embedding itself in clothing, hair, and skin, leaving survivors with the unshakable awareness that they were observed even when the eyes themselves were hidden in shadow. Some awoke to find orange light flickering in puddles that had formed overnight, their reflections fractured and multiplied, the surfaces of water quivering with the movement of eyes that were not theirs, yet precise in every way. Even prayers offered silently beneath blankets or in the remains of churches were heard and catalogued, as if the city had become an altar for its own memory, each gesture, each tear recorded, each whispered name remembered. Survivors discovered that the compulsion extended beyond streets and buildings. It pressed upon thoughts, bending decisions, shaping hesitation, making the body respond before the mind could command. A laborer lifting a fallen beam found his hands curling at the wrong angles, shoulders tilting subtly in accordance with eyes hidden in ash, and he shivered, realizing that the city was not only counting him, but rewriting the rhythm of his very movements. The ruins themselves seemed to pulse with quiet awareness. Even when unobserved, collapsed walls and charred beams shifted imperceptibly, guiding those who passed, nudging them into spaces where they could be catalogued, their every breath accounted for. By the fifth night, clusters of eyes formed more elaborate faces, some human, some grotesque, their features flickering in ash and smoke, pressing guilt, shame, and fear into those who gazed too long. Survivors could not look away, compelled to remain in the ruined streets, absorbing the tally of the fire, the memories of death, the measure of survival. Even the wind carried whispers, threads of sound that intertwined with the pulse of the city, threading through bones, urging kneeling, bending, submission to observation. And when dawn arrived, the sun rising over blackened roofs, it found bodies arranged with subtle shifts, hands curled and shoulders tilted, eyes reflecting an internalized pattern learned from the persistent, patient gaze of the city. Those who had stared longest carried the imprint of ash and light in every movement, a quiet obedience they could not shake, a rhythm of presence dictated by fires long extinguished yet alive in every glowing point, every whispering name, every methodical blink that reminded them, unceasingly, that London had not forgotten, that the tally was eternal, and that the city itself was patient beyond comprehension, waiting, always waiting, for the living to bend, to align, and to be recorded. The city council dismissed the reports as hysteria, dismissing tremors in the streets and whispers carried on the wind as the imaginings of exhausted survivors. Yet the phenomena could not be denied by those who walked along the banks of the Thames. The river itself seemed alive with flickering light, small points of orange and gold dancing among waterlogged debris, reflecting in puddles and waves as if the fire had left a memory embedded in the current. Sailors swore they could hear names called from the riverbanks, carried by the fog-laden wind over broken bridges and collapsed wharves, voices that lingered just long enough to press against thought, pressing the sense of inevitability into the chest of any who passed. Smoke clung to the fog in unnatural layers, forming vague silhouettes that shivered with every passing gust, as though figures trapped between the worlds of ash and air trembled for recognition before vanishing entirely when approached. Entire streets seemed to lean forward on certain nights, buildings tilting imperceptibly toward those who moved along their blackened cobblestones, as if the very structures had grown eyes, assessing, judging, measuring the living against some tally only they could comprehend. Survivors crossing these streets felt a pull that could not be resisted, a magnetic compulsion that drove them to kneel, to bow, to perform the ritual of acknowledgement before an audience that existed only in the spaces between shadow and light. Ash became a medium of memory, clinging to brick, timber, and clothing, embedding itself in hair, pressed into skin with a thickness that rendered the air itself suffocating and sweet with the residue of fire. Every motion, every tremor of fear, every whispered hesitation was collected in the flickering orbs that multiplied through streets and alleys, glowing in windows and reflecting in puddles, threading through air, light, and water. Those who tried to flee felt the pull follow them, subtle yet unrelenting, a tugging in the spine, a shifting in the angles of knees and shoulders, aligning their movements to a rhythm older than memory itself. Children who crept from ruined homes at dawn for scraps or coins found the eyes waiting, hovering above broken wagons, flickering among charred beams, and the flickering light seemed to curl around them, shaping the timbre of their steps and the pace of their breath. Adults passing through the same streets felt their bodies bending in ways they did not will, shoulders tilting, fingers curling, heads nodding imperceptibly to the invisible auditors that occupied the air above rubble. The fog pressed heavily against skin, bringing with it the scent of burnt timber, resin, and iron, sweet and suffocating, infiltrating homes through cracks and broken windows, threading through clothing, leaving survivors aware that no corner of the city was beyond observation. Markets half rebuilt became theaters of fear. Traders moving wood and stone through streets blackened by smoke noticed flickers and shadows that shifted independently, hovering above boxes of goods, reflecting the movements of those who passed. Every hesitant motion, every glance away from the ruins, was recorded in the patient orbs, stored in an architecture of light that transcended brick and mortar, becoming the ledger of the city itself. At night, the glow became more elaborate, points of orange forming human-like features in the shadows of collapsed homes, faces frozen in expressions of accusation, fear, or longing, their light pulsing with rhythm that echoed the heartbeat of the living. The wind carried whispers and fragments, names spoken in cadence with the pulse of those who had survived the fire, pressing guilt and memory into minds, as if the city itself had learned to claim conscience along with movement. Even those who slept behind closed shutters or within hastily constructed shelters felt the pressure of awareness, limbs adjusting unconsciously, knees bending, hands curling in mimicry of gestures that had not yet been made. Shadows along walls thickened, stretching toward passers-by, coiling around ankles and wrists, climbing like smoke through floors, and survivors became vessels for observation, compelled to move in harmony with rhythms not their own. Ash, soot, and smoke were no longer inert, each particle suspended in air, reflecting light and memory, a medium for consciousness beyond the fire, a witness older than the men who walked the streets. Entire neighborhoods seemed to breathe with this presence, alleys contracting and expanding subtly, doors leaning, windows bowing, and the city itself became a patient auditor, cataloging the minutiae of human survival. Those who paused, who lingered too long in the ruins, felt the ledger of memory weigh upon them, shoulders subtly tilting, fingers curling, eyes widening in recognition of the tally being taken. The Thames reflected every flicker of light, every movement of ash and ember, and those who walked its banks saw not their own reflections but the multitude of eyes that recorded them, the whispers pressing into the chest like a subtle, suffocating tide. Even as dawn came, scattering fog and softening shadows, survivors emerged altered. Their steps carried the imprint of observation, their gestures bent subtly to the rhythm of the unseen audience. The city had become an entity of memory and patient judgment, recording not merely the events of the fire, but the motion of those who had survived, the trembling of hands, the hesitation of breath, the furtive glance toward shadows that might be more than absence. By the end of each night, it was clear to all who moved among the ruins that London had claimed dominion not through destruction alone, but through memory, through observation, through the patient accumulation of the fire's aftermath, and that every living soul had become a participant in a record that could not be escaped, a ledger that stretched through streets, through fog, through eyes that blinked in ash and shadow, and through the very pulse of the city itself. Weeks passed, and the eyes no longer remained tethered to ruins alone. They slipped into every reflection, shimmering in polished brass, catching the flicker of candlelight in puddles still clinging to cobblestones, lingering behind shutters and windows that had been closed against the smoke and ash. Survivors began to wake to rooms that seemed emptier than before, only to find points of orange light hovering near hearths, flickering with patience and naming the absent. Children who had wandered, friends lost in the chaos, husbands and wives who had sought safety elsewhere. The air itself carried a subtle vibration, pressing against walls, threading along floors, slipping beneath blankets and through clothing, a weight that could not be shaken, a presence that washed without gesture or threat, yet filled every perception with insistence. Panic rippled through the city, growing like a fever in the streets, in the marketplaces, in the narrow alleys where burned timber leaned precariously over blackened stone. People dared not speak of it aloud, for to name the eyes seemed to call them closer, to render oneself an entry in their ever-growing ledger. Even those who had fled London found no respite, for in dreams the fire continued, and the eyes arrived there with the same meticulous patience, blinking in rhythm with the heart, naming those who slept as if the tally of existence could not be confined to waking hours. They multiplied in reflections, shimmering on the surface of water in barrels and troughs, mirrored in copper pots and the polished edges of furniture recovered from ruin, and always they blinked, always they counted. Those who attempted to hide beneath thick blankets or behind bolted doors felt their bodies shift without volition, fingers curling, knees tilting, shoulders adjusting in subtle obedience to a presence that demanded recognition, that had learned the rhythm of human motion and sought perfect alignment with it. Children ceased wandering at dusk, yet at dawn their absence was catalogued, and the orange light hovered near empty beds, tracking every tremor of the blankets, recording the spaces they had left behind. Merchants attempting to resume trade found that every coin, every tool, every wooden crate reflected the eyes, multiplying and gathering along surfaces, a patient gaze that measured hesitation, fear, and curiosity with equal diligence. The scent of smoke, long thought dissipated, returned with subtle insistence, clinging to hair, skin, and clothing, threaded with ash and resin, sweet and suffocating, pressing memory into every breath. Even the most rational, those who had survived the fire without witnessing the deaths of neighbors, felt unease twist in the marrow, an intimate knowledge pressed into bones that the city had seen, that the fire had recorded, that the eyes continued to measure. Streets once considered safe now bore points of orange among the rubble of partially rebuilt houses, and those who walked too slowly found themselves compelled to quicken, to align movement with a rhythm they did not understand yet could not resist. Night became a continuous extension of day. The city did not sleep, and survivors realized that the pulse of observation continued in shadows, in reflections, in the corners of their vision that no logic could dismiss. Attempts to flee by river or cart proved futile, for the Thames carried not only the smell of smoke but the flicker of eyes in waves and eddies, glimmering among debris, counting the living as surely as it had the dead. Families huddled together in what remained of their homes felt fingers twitching, hands bending subtly, limbs aligning in imperceptible choreography dictated by the gaze that had settled into every crevice, every surface, every thought. Even in the market squares, partially cleared of rubble, clusters of eyes emerged in reflections on brass scales, silver coins, and the polished timber of newly erected stalls, naming traders who had survived, their movements unconsciously bent to match the rhythm of observation, recording hesitation and fear as meticulously as the fire had recorded flame. Those who dared to wander at night discovered that the fog carried points of orange light that shifted with the pulse of their heart, that hovered at eye level, that tracked each step with deliberate patience, waiting for every moment of weakness, every hesitation, every glance away from what the city demanded be acknowledged. Survivors began to move in near silence, their gestures constrained, their actions measured, their breath taken with careful attention, as if obedience alone could protect them from notice, yet the eyes continued to follow, to blink, to count, demanding acknowledgement without pause, without fatigue, their presence eternal and inexorable. In dreams, the fire continued, not as an image but as a living ledger, recording each thought, each twitch of muscle, each faltering pulse, and those who had left the city awoke to find eyes flickering in puddles along roads far from London, naming them, reminding them that flight was illusion, that observation extended beyond walls, streets, rivers, and dreams. The city had become a patient and meticulous auditor, its memory inscribed not only in ash and soot, not only in charred timber and crumbled brick, but in the rhythm of every surviving pulse, in the subtle bending of limbs and the shift of eyes, in the tremor of every breath that dared to pass through streets once burned and now watched. No one left entirely, for even the act of leaving carried them into the ledger. Every moment of survival recorded, every hesitation measured, every glance catalogued, until each living soul had become a participant in an ongoing ritual of observation, in a tally that would not end, in the patient and insatiable gaze of a city that had learned to see, to remember, and to name. Months passed, and London began the slow, trembling work of rebuilding, the streets filled with the noise of hammer and saw, the smell of fresh timber mingling uneasily with lingering smoke and char. Survivors moved among the partially restored facades with a tentative hope, but beneath the surface of bricks and plaster, the city had already inscribed itself into memory, embedding a ledger invisible to the eye, yet insistent upon every breath and movement. The eyes that had haunted alleys, ruins, and puddles no longer appeared openly, yet their absence felt heavier than their presence, a patient silence that pressed against skulls, threaded through the sinew, settling into the rhythm of the heart. Children playing among newly raised beams felt tremors in the air, the subtlest tug at shoulders and knees, as if unseen auditors measured the arc of each step, cataloging innocence alongside fear. Tradesmen placing goods on polished counters discovered reflections in brass scales and copper pots, faint flickers of orange light that pulsed with awareness, naming them, counting them, recording subtle hesitations in fingers and the tremble of arms. Even those who believed themselves beyond observation, the wealthy, the officials, the city councilors, found their routines bent subtly. Pens paused in midair, hands hovered over coins, heads tilted in unconscious compliance to rhythms they did not understand yet obeyed. One evening, a man walking past freshly painted facades felt a sudden weight in his chest, a pressure that tightened ribs and constricted breath, forcing him to glance upward, and there it was, a single eye burning in a window above, unblinking, accusatory, demanding recognition. The light was orange, molten, alive, threading through shadows, and in its glare he felt every hesitation he had carried since the fire, every thought unspoken, every step taken in doubt or fear. His throat went dry, knees weakened, and he could not tear his gaze away, understanding in that instant that the fire had never ended, that the ledger continued to write itself invisibly through the motions of the living. Along streets that now appeared orderly and safe, survivors felt invisible fingers tracing along their spines, mapping the subtle curve of shoulders, the angles of heads, the bend of elbows, embedding themselves into a geometry older than the fire, older than memory itself. The city had become both witness and auditor, patient beyond comprehension, recording every breath, every tremor, every flicker of thought, inscribing it into the architecture, into the air, into reflections in brass and glass, embedding a ledger of life in the very matter of London. Markets rebuilt with polished timber and fresh paint carried under their surfaces the memory of ruin. Every coin exchanged, every barrel rolled, every footstep over new cobblestones became part of the tally, the pulse of the city intertwining with the pulse of the living. Those who slept behind closed doors dreamed of fire. Orange light blinked in dreams, naming the living, demanding acknowledgement, threading guilt, memory, and fear into the marrow, bending the mind to rhythm, embedding obedience in sinew and bone. Streets at dawn were calm, sunlight reflecting from clean windows and rooftops, yet the survivors moved with a subtle stiffness, an awareness that someone, or something, was cataloging them, recording the motion of eyes, the trembling of lips, the bend of hands, the tilt of heads. Even the wind seemed to carry the pulse of observation, threading through alleyways, curling along walls, pressing lightly against flesh with a weight that was not air but expectation, a measure older than man, older than fire. Children avoided certain doors, intuitively sensing the gaze behind glass. Merchants hesitated in the doorway of rebuilt shops, aware that every motion, every choice, would be observed and remembered. A man lifting a plank felt his own limbs move slightly against his will, shoulders adjusting, fingers curling, bending to a rhythm of acknowledgement that he had never learned yet could not resist. Shadows lengthened along streets, casting shapes that seemed to stretch toward the living, pressing in subtle ways, threading through posture, motion, and thought. In the parks and courtyards, points of orange light appeared in reflections in puddles, in windows of abandoned structures, in the brass of gates, counting, naming, threading memory into every motion, shaping hesitation, bending the living to the ledger of observation. Even at night, when the city lay silent under moonlight, the pulse persisted. The memory of the fire breathed through cobblestones, through timbers, through plaster, pressing rhythm into limbs, threading thought into motion, bending all who had survived into participation. Survivors walked with a quiet stiffness, eyes scanning but never fully seeing, hearts beating in measured rhythm to a tally they could neither resist nor comprehend, carrying within them the imprint of the city as patient memory. The fire had not ended. It had transformed into consciousness, a ledger eternal and unyielding, threading through air, water, reflection, and shadow, waiting silently for the spark that would awaken it fully. Every living soul in London, whether in rebuilt streets or distant rooms, had been catalogued, every motion recorded, every breath measured, every hesitation noted. The city itself had claimed dominion over the living, an entity patient and insatiable, eternal and unforgiving, embedding itself in the rhythm of existence, waiting for the day when another flame might rise, when another ledger would begin to write, and when the eyes, burning, unblinking, patient, would open once more.